And I remember one day in particular, I came home feeling especially frustrated because one of my students had not only not done any of her homework, but she was also refusing to engage in my lessons. And later on, as I was complaining about this student to my dad, I naively told him how lucky he was to have a smart, hardworking daughter like myself, and not a lazy, rebellious one like her. And my dad's response was that I had no idea what she might have gone through, and therefore I had no right to judge her. I had no idea what her situation at home was like, or whether she even had a proper home to go back to. And he was right. I had no idea. Now, the research tells us that quick judgments like these are a reflection of the fundamental attribution error. When we observe a person's behavior, our minds tend to conclude that the person who performed that behavior was predisposed to do so. For example, a student who is not performing well in school is lazy, rather than to consider possible situational constraints. And this is something that we all do. It's a natural tendency that we have, and it also forms the basis of the us versus them dynamic, or a lot of the stereotypes that we form today. But sometimes the consequences of the fundamental attribution error are a lot less benign, especially when it affects the decision-making process of policymakers. Now let me give you an example. When Hurricane Katrina hit New Orleans in 2005, despite a mandatory evacuation order, thousands of people stayed behind to ride out the storm. Many died or were left stranded, leaving officials and the general public wondering why. Why didn't these people evacuate? So many saw those staying behind as a choice to stay and blamed the victims for their plight. As then Secretary of Homeland Security Michael Chertoff put it, officials called for a mandatory evacuation. Some people chose not to obey that order. That was a mistake on their part. And when relief workers from around the country were asked to provide 3 words to describe those who evacuated in advance of the hurricane and those who stayed behind, their responses were also telling. Those who left were more often described as intelligent, responsible, self-reliant, whereas those who had chosen to stay behind were described as foolish, stubborn, or lazy for not listening to the evacuation orders. So here you can see how the fundamental attribution error led to an empathy gap among policymakers and those who had chosen to stay, and how this not only affected their assessment of their crisis, but also their response to the crisis. But really, how many victims had actually chosen to stay? Later on, public opinion polls showed that the victims of Hurricane Katrina were largely from the lower income households without a car or financial means to get out of town. They also had less access to news and other media networks and smaller social networks than those who had evacuated. And then the story as to why they didn't evacuate becomes very different. But as policymakers, if we let our biases color the analysis, we miss these important details and we attribute people's actions to stupidity or laziness rather than to their very real circumstances. And we not only isolate people, but we prevent good policies from being made. Now, I'm sure you can think of a lot more examples of the fundamental attribution error, be it in your own personal lives or even to explain other gaps in policymaking. And the question is, how can we overcome the fundamental attribution error and bridge the divide among people? Now, psychologists have also found that the best way to reduce the fundamental attribution error is through the use of real-life examples while emphasizing the powerful social and situational factors that contributed to them. And that is exactly what an online policy simulation aims to do. So my online policy simulation, 1 week, uses real-life examples to highlight the situational constraints. When designing the game, I asked myself, what's the biggest hurdle to creating a just, peaceful, and inclusive society? And the answer was to bridge the empathy gaps among people by raising awareness of other people's circumstances. So when we think of public policy, we think of ways to design policies to improve the lives of other people. But how does one even begin to design policies to address the needs of the less privileged when one might not even be able to relate to their experiences? Online policy games allow us to put ourselves in the shoes of another person and view things from their perspective. So the game I designed currently features the profiles of a single parent, a senior citizen, and an immigrant. When you play the game and you click on a profile, you become that person and are then confronted with some of the choices and the consequences they are faced with on a day-to-day basis. And as you can see from the example here, the kind of scenarios depicted in the game reflect the kind of trade-offs that a lot of us today take for granted. And as a policymaker, when you play the game, you will be asked to make your selection at this point. There are no right or wrong answers. Whatever selection that you choose will then show you the implication. If you had chosen to try to save some money and opted to take the bus here is the policy implication for this scenario. An example of a policy recommendation that could arise from this scenario could be something like locating childcare services at the workplace or even having express bus services during peak hour traffic. Now here is another example of a scenario in the game. In this case, some of us might opt to skip lunch or to forego lunch completely just to save some money. And the trade-off in this case would not be a financial one, but would be one related to our well-being, where we would be foregoing an opportunity to bond with our colleagues. And now finally, don't be fooled by the word game. Designing this actually involves a rigorous evidence-based process. So the game is designed in 3 key stages. In the first stage, data is collected by the people on the ground, be it your social workers, humanitarian aid workers, or even your academics conducting research. This data is then churned and transformed to create the profile, scenarios, and the consequences. Data mining is already being used to help businesses better understand their customers. So data mining can also be used to help policymakers better understand the people. Policymakers can then play the game when they attend, for example, training workshops at the Civil Service College. It is my hope that through online policy games, we not only empower policymakers to be better informed when designing policies, but we also enable a more compassionate and a less hostile society. Through this, we can hopefully try to bridge a little bit more of the empathy gap and the disconnect that we have with one another. Thank you.